Well, let's go ahead and get started then. Welcome everyone to our YPDA legislative session talk story. I'm going to stop the sharing. My name is Ryan Catalani. I am one of our YPDA co-chairs this year, and I'm really excited to introduce our two representatives who are joining us today, both of which were former YPDA board members as well. We have first Representative Jeanné Kapela from House District 5 on the Big Island, and Representative Adrian from District 22. I want to let everyone know in the audience you can go ahead and put questions in the chat if you like as you start thinking of them, and we'll try to fold them in throughout the conversation. So just to start setting the stage, I'd like to ask each of you, Rep. Kapela and Rep. Tam, what you did, a little bit about yourselves, like what you did before being elected, your background, and just a little bit about your district where you represent.
I'll go first. So aloha, my name is Adrian Tam. I want to thank Ryan and Will for inviting me here, and it's so good to see that there are a lot of new, young, bright faces in YPDA. Both Jeanné and I had very fond memories there with Will and Ryan and Fu and everyone. I was elected with Jeanné at the same time in 2020. We both joined together as freshmen. And prior to that, I worked in real estate as a real estate agent just to help, first-time home buyers. And we also had an initiative in our own real estate company to try to get, foreign investors to sell their property back to Hawaii residents here. Aside from that, I also worked as a staffer at the state Senate under Senator Stanley Chang. I was motivated to run because, there was a lot of outstanding issues and I felt like we were moving at a very snail's pace towards it. And there weren't really new innovative ideas being discussed. And I'm looking forward to meeting all of you and answering some of your questions, and even getting to know you as well. So thank you.
Hi friends, I on Saturdays teach dance class at Kona Dance and Performing Arts in my district. Hi, this is one of my students, Lalea. But next door, our neighbor has decided that they want to vacuum. So I'm just gonna find a new space. My name is Jeanné Kapela. I represent District 5. So that's Kona and Ka'u on the Big Island. As Rep. Tam said, he and I came in together, and I think we're a part of a new generation of legislators that are coming from a space of urgency. For us, we look at the climate crisis, we look at the lack of a living wage, we look at economic injustice and racial injustice that's happening across our country. And these are the things that are going to impact us and our children and our children's children for every generation to come unless we act now. So I think there's a lot of urgency with this new generation of leadership, and I'm proud to be a part of it. Prior to this, I worked as a service provider for survivors of human trafficking for an organization that I started called Unite Hawaiʻi, and it's since been folded into an organization called Imua Alliance. And what else did I do? I worked with Young Progressives Demanding Action. I was a board member for a number of different organizations in my community. So getting really close to my community and recognizing the need, I think, was one of the big reasons why I decided to run for office. I didn't come from a background of privilege. And I think oftentimes we look at legislators, and I think one of the biggest issues is that they're so disconnected, right? There's this lack of humanity because when you've done the same thing for so long, you're going to get the same result. And we always see that legislators and leaders have to be these doctors or lawyers or business executives, but the reality is they need to be everyday people. So I come from really a background of poverty. And for me, the reason I fight for a living wage isn't because I read about poverty in a book. It's because I've experienced it. I think that there are so many people in our state and in my rural community that are experiencing those same issues as well. So it's a privilege to be able to be in the legislature working alongside colleagues like Rep. Tam and like Rep. Peruso, fighting for a progressive future that works for everyone, not just for the privileged few. I think they stopped vacuuming, so I'm going to move back outside.
Sounds good. Well, thank you both. So you mentioned you were both elected just 2 years, 1.5 years ago in 2020. Can you tell us a little bit about your top legislative priorities since then and what progress you've been able to make?
Yeah. Yeah, so some of my top priorities is from just small community issues, from improving safety, whether it's crosswalks or to homelessness, trying to get homeless into shelters. One of the bills that I passed last year was a bill that would allow minors that are unaccompanied to consent to shelters, because I was shocked to find out that, you know, some shelters had to deny minors shelter at night because they weren't with a parent and they couldn't consent to them. So that was one of my priorities. Another big priority that I have been really invested in is diversifying our economy. The pandemic has basically shown us that tourism is not sustainable, and the other economy is military, and in my opinion, that's not sustainable either, and probably not something that we really want to invest in either. One of the things that I believe that we should invest in is renewable and clean energy. So I introduced a bill this past year called HB 1501. 1501 will basically allow a research facility in the University of Hawaii to partner up and to develop with any kind of entity to develop this green renewable technology and to help diversify our economy by hiring individuals and training individuals. We have made a lot of strides towards that. One of the bills that was introduced and passed last year was to the establishment of a green jobs program. And the state government is actually in the process of now hiring individuals for those green jobs, because they've already established the framework since the passage of that bill and the signing into law. So those are just some of the priorities that I've been working on. And, again, there's always going to be some big issue. There's always going to be something. And, it's the kind of outside of the box thinking that I want to bring to the legislature to fix these issues as we face them.
I love this question because I think there's never a shortage of things to work on, especially as a progressive. So I am wearing my living wage shirt. One of the things that I'm really proud of is having introduced a living wage bill, working very closely with the Working Families Coalition, as well as Raise Up Hawaiʻi and the living wage folks. So fighting for an $18 an hour minimum wage at least, and then pegging that to our cost of living so that we aren't coming back and legislators don't look at the minimum wage as job security for themselves, but we look at it as security for our communities. So fighting for that. We've also worked on a number of social justice issues and economic justice issues. So not just a living wage, but ensuring that we have this social safety net for our communities. So having paid sick and family leave, two things that we're still struggling to get even in the middle of a pandemic. So the other thing that I've really worked on, and this what I'm really excited about this year, is tax fairness, taxing the rich. We've seen throughout COVID, millionaires and billionaires add tons and tons of money to their bank accounts at the expense of everyday working people who are struggling to put food on the table. So we have an EITC bill that's alive this year. It's currently, I think, one of the only standalone EITC bills, and it's one of the only tax fairness bills, House Bill 1507, raises capital gains to help make the EITC permanent and refundable, which I think is absolutely incredible and so necessary. And then I've also, as the vice chair of the House Education Committee, been very committed to education and access to quality education. We know that our education system historically has been underfunded, and it's going all the way back to the plantation era, where wealthy plantation owners didn't want to fund public education for fear that students and the children of plantation workers would rise up and recognize the abuse that they're seeing and revolt. So historically, that's been where our education system has come from. So working on fully funding education, getting access to quality education here in our state, working on the bus driver shortage. I think the reality is that our bus drivers need to be unionized. So working on something like that to ensure that our students not only have a quality education, but have access to that education. And then I think also we've even with Rep. Tam, we worked very heavily on racial justice. So we have a number of bills this year. My office introduced the Briones Law bill again. And I think the reality is it's a difficult, until we get more progressives in the legislature, these are difficult conversations to have with our colleagues, and they're difficult issues to pass. So I just want to say thank you to the advocates who have been pushing and fighting for these things, like ending cash bail, which I think is moving this year. And I think I have hope that it's going to pass.
Great, thank you both. And thank you for being in the building and helping to push these priorities forward. I mean, we couldn't do it without you. Neither of you are strangers to the legislative process. You were both advocates, you worked as legislative staffers. Now that you're on the other side of the desk, what surprised you the most about working as a legislator versus an advocate?
I think as an advocate, we tend to be surrounded by individuals who I would like to say think like us and kind of echo the sentiments that we believe in. But since being in the legislature, we kind of represent in a major group of all kinds of groups of individuals now. So we're hearing all sides of every single argument. And that adds a lot of pressure to a legislature because you don't know, well, which side is the right side. So I would say that was what surprised me of how much pressure it was going to be, but it was expected that there was going to be that pressure. I don't know, Jeanné, you feel the same way as I feel.
I definitely agree with the pressure. You walk into the legislature and from day one, there's someone trying to sell you something or buy you. And you have to be, I think internally, you have to know which side you're on. Like, yes, there is compromise. Yes, we get to a space of compromise. We have to. But I think for so long, people on the left have always started from a compromised position. And that's why we always end up moving towards the right. And for me, maybe it's been incredibly difficult, but I think the reality is that I've been lucky to have a really strong team that surrounded me that always helped me be accountable. And I think the reality is having conversations like this, where we are sticking really closely to the people that we know are on the right side. The people are on the right side. Our communities are on the right side. So I think having really strong allies and remaining close to the people that I know are struggling has been really helpful. But I will say there is a lot of pressure in the legislature, and we have to elect individuals who will be able to decipher and hold true to that compass and not start from a compromised position, but start from the position of the left and hold true to that. So when we actually do compromise, we end up somewhere in the middle, never towards the right.
It's a great perspective, and you were getting some clap emojis from the audience throughout that. So in case you couldn't see the list there, on that front where you're talking about the pressure and everyone trying to get a piece of the pie. It's interesting because there has been heightened scrutiny of the legislature, like since you have both been in office, with the Supreme Court ruling against gut and replace last November, and of course, more recently, the convictions of Kalani English and Ty Cullen. Have you noticed any shifts in how your colleagues are working or yourselves are working as a result of these?
For myself, I've never changed. I've always acted on the side of ethics. For one, for selfish reasons, I am afraid to go to jail. But also, we got into elected office to make improvements. And one of the things that Jeanné and I wanted to do was restore public trust in our system and to make our system work. And, if we were to engage in that, we're basically making the system worse. And that's why, I would never do that. And in terms of like a shifting to try to revamp our ethics, I noticed that, since then we have increased funding towards our ethics commission. I think we are in the process of probably expanding it, and we're passing out bills towards making mandatory ethics training for all government workers. And we are passing a slew of election campaign finance reform bills, such as a ban on fundraisers during the legislative session.
Got some thumbs up with that.
Yeah, I think Rep Tam is correct. We have to move in this space of really having clean elections and creating a clean government. And hi, thank you, chickens in the background. They're like, yes. Can you tell I'm from South Kona? But I think one of the big things that I recognize in the legislature is that it is so patriarchal. It's an incredibly toxic culture. And there are these power struggles constantly happening in the legislature. And that leads to what we were talking about just in the last question, right? About what are some of the pressures. But I think that one of the things that I've recognized for myself is that I have to call out harassment whenever it happens in any form. Doesn't matter if it comes from a friend, from a non-friend, from whatever side it's coming from, but being able to call those things out is a part of shifting that toxic culture. One of the first things that I always tell people when they're about to run for office is get yourself a really good therapist, because you're going to need one. I think another thing that the legislature has done is open the building. And I think that that should have been done a really long time ago. But I think it's a step in the right direction. I think having that transparency, having individuals in the building, having this opportunity to do virtual and live testimony is going to be really beneficial. But I think the other thing is that Rep Tam is correct. We have to elect individuals that we know are going to stand on the side of justice. And that means in everything that they're doing, not just in the public eye, but behind a closed door, because at the end of the day, that's what affects the public. So having strong ethical individuals, and I think that a 2-hour ethics meeting with the Ethics Commission doesn't shift that. I think it's a long-term cultural shift that happens through electing better individuals.
You know, with the reopening of the building, I saw something interesting from Senator Chang the other day saying how our Capitol building is the only one without private hallways, which is kind of a neat fact. And, you know, it does go to, you know, the spirit of what you're talking about, that if we have people in office who are committed to the right things, that's what it's designed for. You know, shifting to more specific things this legislative session. You each started a new caucus this year. Rep Kapela started the Working Families Caucus, and Rep Tam started the LGBTQ Equality Caucus. Can you tell us about your motivation for starting these caucuses and what you've been able to accomplish so far?
Oh yeah, the LGBT Equality Caucus was inspired by equality caucuses and LGBT caucuses in other states. In December, I had the wonderful opportunity of going to an LGBT International Leadership Conference in Washington, D.C., where I met with other LGBT leaders who have started their own caucuses. And I was wondering, well, why doesn't Hawaii have one? West Virginia has one, and you know, we can't let that happen. We cannot be the last. And there are a lot of outstanding LGBT issues that need to be addressed. You know, minors cannot consent to HIV treatment and prevention. You know, we are working with the Keiki Caucus to pass HB 1697, which would train our teachers to be cognizant of our LGBT community and to understand where they're coming from and make our education more inclusive for our queer students. We are trying to fight a ban on in vitro fertilization, discrimination in vitro fertilization for gay couples. To start, we're looking at starting a LGBTQ plus commission on data collections, a hiring goal for our trans and Mahu community. And we are trying to pass legislation that would prevent discrimination when it comes to surgeries for our trans folks. So those are some of the issues that, you know, I saw that were outstanding for the LGBT community. We've made so much progress when it comes to banning conversion therapy and asking a ban on gay panic defense. But, you know, like Jeanné said, as progressives, the work never ends. And that's why, you know, I felt compelled to start this caucus.
I am so grateful to be a member of the LGBTQ caucus and the Equality Caucus, right? To be fighting for every single person to have the opportunity to thrive, right? And to know who they are and to be respected for being themselves. And it's a privilege. So I'm grateful to Rep. Tam for his creation of that caucus. We started the Working Families Caucus, and I think it was really a step away from the actual Progressive Caucus. I think there are a number of individuals who are not necessarily progressive that sit on the Progressive Caucus. And for me, as someone who really fights for these values and has taken a lot of hits for staying true to my values, I felt like I wanted to find and create a space where we were actually being led by advocates. We know that advocates are always on the right side. So we wanted to find a space to bring those voices into the legislature and really be led by the values that we have. So I often call them my North Stars, and we continue to fight for the same values of creating a minimum wage or having an actual living wage, creating paid sick and family leave, working on adjusting the UI to not be taxed for income tax. That was something that so many people struggled with. When I was getting my own taxes done last year, had I not had a job, there's no way that I would have been able to afford paying the UI income tax. And I really suffered. And I've watched other people suffer in the same tax office, grown men crying, women crying because they can't afford these things. So we worked on that. Tax fairness. So we have the EITC bill, House Bill 507, which is still alive and moving, and I'm really proud of that. We also worked on, I'm sorry, there's so many cars moving around outside. So I hope you can still hear me. But we also worked on a renter's credit bill. So adjusting the renter's credit, which hasn't been adjusted since the 80s. So working on things like that, we know they impact workers and they impact families. So one of the biggest issues for us was just being able to create a space where we are really fighting for working families and ensuring that voice is being heard and that legislators have an opportunity to listen and learn.
Thank you both for spearheading such important initiatives in those two areas. And Rep. Kapela, not to worry, Zoom's magic is working very well. The noise reduction, we can hardly hear anything. I mean, outside of your own voice. So you brought up living wage, and that is a topic probably on everyone's mind right now, at least in this call. I know a lot of us were at the living wage rally at the Capitol this past week, and others may just be following the news. So can you, one of you, tell us a little bit about where the House and Senate bills are at and where they might be headed?
Okay, well, we just heard, we're at crossover now, which is very exciting. We're halfway there. We passed out of the House floor, and it's now heading to the Senate, the House's minimum wage proposal, House Bill 2510, which needs a lot of work. I voted against it, and the reason I voted against it is because it just doesn't go far enough. We know that our own department of Business and Economic Development has told us that a living wage is at least $18. It's at $19 now. And if we wait till 2028 or 2030, which it originally was at, it's going to be at $26. And we're just going to be further and further and further behind. And working families, they can't afford that. The other big issue with the current House proposal is that it has a tip credit, and it's a very high tip credit. We have to eliminate the tip credit. I found it really interesting the other day that there was a tipped worker or someone that worked in the service industry that said, we have to increase the tip credit because this allows, this is the reason why businesses feel that they can take money. And I was so confused because I realized that this individual had been told by his business owner or whoever he works with that the tip credit is something that's necessary so that they're not taking money out of his paycheck. And we have to start talking about it not as a tip credit, but as a tip penalty, because a tipped worker shouldn't be having money taken out of their paycheck just because they're getting a tip, just for doing their job. So we need to make sure that that's eliminated. The Senate proposal is still in the House chamber. So we have to get it to be heard. And I think the reality is that Chair Onishi, and I'm sad to say, but another member that came in with both Rep Tam and I, Rep Sayama, is our roadblocks to the success of passing a living wage. I voted against this bill because I felt that it doesn't go far enough to support families. There was another individual that stood up on the House floor, the vice chair of the Labor Committee, that said that it goes too far and that it's 2028 is too quick of a raise. And I think that these are the things that we need to work on. We need to work with these individuals and show them again and again and again why families are suffering, and that raising the minimum wage, eliminating the tip credit, and pegging it to the cost of living are necessary.
Yeah, I want to add to that, Jeanné is absolutely right. We need to make our colleagues understand why the minimum wage needs to be $18 by 2026, and we need to eliminate the tip credit. What I'm hopeful about is that nothing is solid until May. We have time. And for me, what motivates me to keep pushing on this, and what's even motivating even more is just listening to the community. So sure, the arguments from the chamber, they showed statistics, etc. But I listened to my community, and the community, I believe, is hurting, and they told me they're hurting, and I see them hurting. They're working 2 or 3 jobs just to get by, and on top of that, they need to take care of their kids. They need to cook, cook for themselves. They need rest, and they can't do that if they're working 18-hour days or so. And that's why, for me, it has to be 18 by 2026. And I'm hopeful that we can continue to push this livable wage effort to convince our colleagues that 18 by 2026 is the right way to go.
Thank you both for championing this important issue for working families. Native Hawaiian issues have also been, I think, a big focus this legislative session. There was the push to provide a historic and, long overdue amount of funding to the Department of Hawaiian Homelands, along with overhauling the management of Mauna Kea. Tell us about where you stand on these issues and how you see them playing out the rest of this legislative session.
The historical trauma done towards Native Hawaiians happens on a daily basis. Indigenous erasure is something that we see every single day in so many different parts of our lives. And I think that this is a small step that the legislature can take in order to help undo a lot of that historical injustice and trauma. I think the reality is that Speaker Saiki stood up on the House floor on opening day and said he's committed to ensuring that Native Hawaiians get this $600 million for Hawaiian homelands. So yay, I think we're gonna get it done. And I think that there's a lot of support around that. So I'm grateful. Someone just ran down behind me. Oh no, I think it was someone else. I'm looking at someone else's screen. But I'm proud of that. Oftentimes in my office, we're talking about looking at every single issue through a decolonial lens. And so much more of that needs to happen. The Mauna Kea issue is so difficult. It's difficult to talk about. It's difficult to deal with. But I think the reality is that UH has been a terrible steward of the Mauna. And one of the reasons why I voted on with reservations on the Mauna Kea bill is because UH cannot be the steward. So we have to find a new steward for Mauna Kea, and it needs to be the state. It needs to be Native Hawaiians, but Native Hawaiians need to have this voice that is strong and impactful. And I will say one of the things that I've really struggled with the most is that I've never faced more racism in my life than the emails that I got from astronomers and friends of the astronomy community. There's a space for astronomy. It's not on Mauna Kea. And I think Native Hawaiians have said that. We're going to keep saying it. And I think that because we're on Native land, that needs to be honored.
Jeanné is absolutely right. For me, the $600 million going towards Native Hawaiian homeland is going to push the needle in terms of fulfilling an unfulfilled promise towards our Native Hawaiian community. But it's not just money. it's also wise leadership that needs to be done. So, even though we give them the $600 million, I'm confident that legislators like Jeanné Kapela and Rep. Stacey and Eli are going to keep a close eye on DHHL to ensure that money actually goes towards, building infrastructure like roads and sewage and houses, and not just into the pockets of consultants. Another bill that Jeanné and I voted against is the idea of legalizing gambling to fund DHHL. If you look from a historic standpoint on gambling, it has traumatized so much communities, from working families to Indigenous women. I often talk about the bankruptcy side of things because I worked in finance. But from Jeanné's standpoint, being an advocate for victims of sex trafficking victims, there's a really dark side to this too. And we heard Native Hawaiians voice their opposition towards the community, this push for gambling, because they know they've had, women being dragged out of their own homes and kidnapped. And all we know is that bringing in gambling is just gonna make it worse and exasperate it. On the issue of Mauna Kea, Jeanné is absolutely right. There is astronomy, but it cannot get in the way of cultural practices and preserving Native Hawaiians' right to engage in those cultural practices. I'm really grateful that the House has taken this initiative of bringing stakeholders together to form this working group on the future of Mauna Kea. And Thomas is absolutely right about water too. Red Hill is a Native Hawaiian issue. Water is life. And, progressives were one of the first to sound the alarm of what's going on at Red Hill with the Sierra Club. And, it's sad that it takes something like, oh, someone has drank fuel to finally push us to do something. But, now that something has happened, things are moving. The Navy has just announced that they're going to shut down and defuel the Red Hill tanks. So I think that, progressives have always been on the right side of issues, especially when it comes to looking at long-term wise. And this is especially in particular towards Native Hawaiian issues.
Thanks. Yeah, I appreciated too what Rep. Kapela said about the looking at these issues through a decolonial lens. I think it's so important. And Rep. Tam, your continued support and bringing up Red Hill into the mix too. I think actually we had that on the list of questions too. So if Rep. Kapela, you want to chime in on anything about Red Hill as well, about any efforts to hold the federal government accountable or help to mitigate the current water crisis.
Absolutely. I think one of the big things that we just talked about decolonization, but I think one of the other things that we really need to focus on is this land back, bodies back movement and reality that we face as Indigenous people, as well as just everyday individuals. We have to focus on this, on demilitarization. I think that's a really big part of the conversation that we have to have, because the military leases are up in 2029. So they're right around the corner. And every single person that's in the legislature currently has never been in that kind of conversation. The last time these leases were up, it was a completely different legislature. It was a completely different game entirely. And the reality is that we have to make it real life. I think oftentimes in the legislature, everything is looked at as a game. Real life is not a game. And I think that every single individual who has been impacted, every single Native Hawaiian living today has lived with this historical trauma from the military. And we have to, I think even when we look at Ukraine and we look at what's happening there, we have to remember that more guns don't make us safer. More money in our military industrial complex doesn't make us safer. More guns in our schools, more police officers in our communities don't make our communities safer. The reality is we make each other safer. We make our community safer by focusing on humanitarian action, by focusing on educating individuals, we focus on lifting people out of poverty. We know that poverty causes crime. And that really the reality is that poverty is just a symptom of systemic oppression. And the military industrial complex is one of the ways that the United States has kept people oppressed, specifically BIPOC and Native Hawaiian individuals. So I think one of the big things that we need to talk about when we're talking about Red Hill, when we're talking about Mauna Kea, when we're talking about Kuakaloa, when we're talking about land leases in the state of Hawaii, when we're talking about Hawaii in general, we have to look at it from a decolonial frame, but we also have to talk about demilitarization and moving in that direction, because that's what's going to make us safer.
Thanks. Yeah, well said. And, that segues right into another topic we wanted to talk about related to public safety, the criminal legal system. There are some efforts that are still alive. The cash bail reform bill, as you mentioned, and, Rep. Sylvia Luke said that this was in fact a reason why the House just removed funding for planning a new jail in Halava. So can you talk a little bit about any criminal legal justice system priorities? Brianna's bill, I know, was carried over, but I'm not sure if, tell us about the status of these and how we can support them.
For me, I tend to focus on recidivism rates. Right now we have a system where, you leave jail, you have nowhere else to go, and then you're back in jail. And there really is no program or streamline or any resources for individuals to find, job retraining or, social workers or housing. So during the interim last year, I worked with several legislators from Senator Moriwaki and Representative Hashimoto and Speaker Saiki and we created this bill called Project Reset. It would streamline a bunch of services from housing and job retraining and job placement into one area so that those that are discharged or released from our prison system have served their time will be able to enter into and reintegrate back into society. At the same time, I like to look at things in a big picture. One of those things is, social work. Homelessness is a big issue. The lack of social workers is a big issue, especially when we saw the case of Isabel Kalua. And at one of these conferences, I was talking to a rep from New Mexico. And New Mexico is starting this new initiative where they trained inmates in the area of social work. So when they leave, they can be hired as assistants to social workers or community outreach workers, and they can be part of the system, because many of these individuals that are incarcerated right now slipped through the cracks and could have avoided being incarcerated had there been good resources for them to access. And I think that goes to the level of government that we have right now. One of the biggest problems in government I notice is that, we are terrible at communicating things. No one knows what resources are available to them, and they don't know where to look. So these two bills are two bills that are still live right now that I am desperately fighting for, because I feel like it would solve a lot of the problems that pretty much everyone knows is a problem and wants to solve. And these are issues that should have bipartisan support, whether you are a progressive, a moderate, or a conservative.
Okay, the vacuum has started again, so I hope you can hear me. Let me know if you can't. Okay, awesome. And I'm gonna hope that I can hear my thoughts while the vacuum is going. I think Representative Tam talked about a number of really important issues that are still moving in the legislature and conversations that are happening. I think we really need to work on bail reform. That's number one, and I think that there's a really big possibility of that happening this year. I think it's just really important. And I think the other part of it is that we need to really begin banning private prisons and our connection to private prisons. The reality is that I think for so long, we have criminalized and penalized poverty. And with our high cost of living, there are so many individuals in our state who live in poverty or who are just at the cusp of not being able to put food on their table. I can't begin to tell you how many conversations I've had with individuals about whether or not to put food in the gas or food on their table or gas in their car. And that's the reason why they've moved away from our state. I think the other reality is that we can't build the new jail. We have to ensure that that doesn't happen. We have to step away from this carceral standpoint and really begin focusing on investing in people. We have to build people, not prisons. We have to invest in our public education system, not in a new jail. If you don't want a new jail or you don't want people to go to jail, invest in public education. I think that's just the most simple thing that we can do. There are a number of incarcerated women's bills moving through the legislature that I'm really proud of. We're really starting to take this step at looking at the different factors that lead to individuals being incarcerated. And I think one of the biggest issues, of course, is poverty. People living in poverty are just so much more likely to be stuck in this just never-ending loop of incarceration and trauma. I come from that background. Both of my parents at one point in time were incarcerated. And I think that's why I look at things through this lens. But I'm really proud of recently the Women's Legislative Caucus has taken a really big stand, and it's been a bipartisan stand as well. So it's not just a progressive issue. It's an issue that everyone's looking at. Oh, thank God, the vacuuming. I'm like, I can't think. But the Women's Legislative Caucus, as I was talking about, has really taken this strong stand on fighting against incarceration and looking at the issues that women go through and looking at the fact that women have children. For so long, up until 2 years ago, there were the intake form for women who are being incarcerated and moving into the criminal justice system. There was no form that even said like, I have a child, or it's just shocking. So really shifting that, and Judge Browning has been working on the creation of creating a women's court. So beginning to look at these issues that women face specifically, and how can we help prepare individuals to be loved, to be rehabilitated, to be connected to the land that they're at, not sending them to a private prison in Arizona or away from Hawaiʻi, that connects them to who they are and the community that they need to at the end of the day that they're going to come back to. So setting people up to win in life and not setting them up to fail, which is what our current criminal justice system does.
Oh, thank you both. Such deep, interconnected, complex issues that you're working on. So we appreciate the progress on this. And I know that social justice is always going to be one of YPDA's priorities as well. Speaking of deeply entrenched, complicated problems, housing, of course, is a top expense for most families, especially those struggling to make ends meet. And affordable housing apparently remains quite a quandary for the state. Can you tell us a little bit about what the legislature is considering this year to alleviate our housing crisis?
Yes, so housing is definitely a problem. And one thing that the legislature is doing is that we are looking at a lot of our vacant lands to see how can we better utilize that. For my community personally, and I'm just going to pick up, for example, in this area of Waikiki, we have multiple vacant lots here that have been vacant since 1995. And I am very, very, very fortunate to represent a very YIMBY, yes, in my backyard neighborhood board. I know you've never heard that before, but my neighborhood board, the Waikiki Neighborhood Board, has seen these problems persist over time. And they used to be very NIMBY, and they realized that being NIMBY doesn't solve the problem. It actually contributes to the problem. And they have taken positions where they supported, having homeless shelters in the district. Recently, I've introduced a piece of legislation, a resolution that would call on the city to purchase an empty lot up at Liliuokalani Avenue in my district for either any kind of community needs, because we don't know what we have to wait for the survey report to come out. But whether it's sheltering, parking, etc., I just don't like seeing an unutilized plot go unutilized. Additionally, the legislature is passing legislation to try to incentivize landlords and property managers to take in more Section 8 tenants. We have pushed hard for anti-discrimination when it comes to Section 8, but we've found out that there are many ways, even if we were to implement those things, that individuals can go around them and possibly hurt the tenants that are receiving Section 8. So unfortunately, it's kind of back to the drawing board for this thing, because it is a federal issue, but we are committed to trying to incentivize and get our Section 8 tenants into housing. There's also the Aloha Homes proposal. There was a study that was done, and I think the study has pointed out a lot of possibilities, as long as there are tweaks towards that program, that we can implement. But most importantly, I think the biggest housing initiative that we are doing is the $600 million going towards the Hawaiian homelands.
To be very honest, I don't think that our state is doing nearly enough to address affordable housing. We have such a high cost of living here, and in similar states that have the same cost of living, we don't, or they don't, they have a very different definition of affordable housing. So I think the reality is that we need to lower our state's definition of affordable. 80 to 100% AMI is not affordable. People, if you're working a minimum wage job, you can't afford that. If you're working a minimum wage job, we know that you have to work 110 hours a week just to afford a modest 1-bedroom apartment at fair market value. And that is BS. It's just unacceptable. So I actually have a resolution that I introduced calling on the Department of Business, Economic Development, and Tourism to submit a report to the legislature on the barriers to creating affordable housing here in our state. And I think that that's a really good step when we begin to look at shifting what affordable is and what that definition is, because truly affordable housing is closer to 40 to 60% AMI. It's not 80 to 120. And if we want people who are living in Section 8 housing or individuals who are working a minimum wage job, hopefully it'll end up being a living wage job, they'll be able to actually afford housing a roof over their head. I think the other thing is the renter's credit bill that I talked about earlier. So we do know that there's a number of individuals who are renters. And if you want to save for a home, you have to, it's very difficult to save and rent. As someone who spends most of my paycheck goes towards housing. And I'm a legislator. And I think the reality is, if I was working a minimum wage job, it would just be unattainable. All of it is unattainable. I think the other portion, and I think even some of what Rep. Tam talked about, is the fact that we have always catered to tourists. We have always catered to individuals who don't live in our state. And I think the reality is that we need to begin taxing them. We need to tax REITs at a higher, we need to tax them, period, because they're not taxed. And I know that Rep. Tam has been a big proponent of that. But we really need to begin focusing on the families that live here, the individuals that live here, not focusing on this tourism-driven economy and the fact that people want to come here, buy a home 60% higher than any local person could ever afford, and then have it sit empty or rent it on vacation rentals. Most of the Kona Coast is rented on Airbnb, VRBO, any type of vacation rental platform, and it's impossible to find a rental here. That's why when I lived at home or I'm back in my district, I have to live with my family because I just can't afford anything else. And I can't find anything because there's just nothing available. So we really need to shift the way that our state, I think that, yes, 600 million for Native Hawaiians is great. This working on trying to address Section 8, we need to in my opinion, we need to outright ban landlords from discriminating against anyone who tries to use Section 8. And I don't think the bill goes far enough. But yes, it's a great step. But the reality is that we have to completely shift the way that we look at the individuals who live here versus the individuals who are visiting, who are just extractive.
Yeah, thank you both. I mean, it's a mindset shift for what housing means, you know, as a commodity, or is it a right? You know, is it something that everyone just deserves to have as a matter of fact, or something that, you know, we can commercialize for the highest bidder who, you know, everything is affordable to someone at the right income level. You know, as we begin to close up the hour, I know there's so many topics we could talk about at the legislature, so much we didn't get to, but I know we have a lot of advocates on the call. And so I wanted to ask, with the legislature, with the Capitol building reopening, do you have any thoughts about, you know, should advocates start coming out, meeting with legislators, you know, doing things back at the Capitol, or, you know, what's your sense about the best way to do our advocacy moving forward?
I would love to have you guys, all of you, come to my office and visit me. It's been lonely. You know, the Capitol is open and our legislators are in their offices, and, you know, just stopping by and just meeting with the staff goes a long way. You know, because in the past we've just had to schedule meetings by appointments, and oftentimes, you know, you don't really get those appointments because some legislators and staff don't really respond back or aren't interested in meeting you. But when you go to their office, at least you can talk to their staff face to face, and sometimes catch the legislature and talk to them, even if it's by the railing. You know, I've always been welcoming to anyone that wants to come to my office and to talk to me. So please, you know, come to the Capitol and talk to us.
I echo this 100%. Come visit, please. It would be really lovely. I actually had a visit recently from Jun Shin, who is one of my favorite universal progressive advocates, who is just awesome at all the things. And we also had a visit from Bart Dame, who is also on this call. And it was a little bit sad. The very first day that the Capitol reopened, the first advocates or lobbyists that walked through my door were gun rights advocates and like the ultra right. Oh, yikes. So I would love to see happy smiling faces that care about people and the planet, and decolonization and demilitarization and all of the amazing, wonderful things that uplift people in our planet. So please come and visit. I think it's been really interesting. Rep. Tam and I, the entire 2 years that we've been in office, well, almost 2 years now, we haven't had people around us. 2 weeks ago, I went to my very first in-person like event in my community that was like outdoors and semi-unmasked, and it was so interesting because I had never been able to participate in that. Yesterday, the woman who was taking over former Rep. Cullen's seat was sworn in, and I had to be very honest. I had such a tinge of jealousy because she had people in the building when she got sworn in. Rep. Tam and I have gone through 2 opening days with no one around. And I think the reality is that our movement is people-based. It's based on you folks, and it's based on advocacy. And it works when we have people in the building, when we have people outside of the building, when we have pressure from all the angles. That's how we make change happen. It's not one person or 2 people, it's all of us working together. So I'm grateful that the building is open. It's about damn time. And the reality is that I can't wait to see you folks in there. I can't wait to hear you chanting in the rotunda. I can't wait to welcome you in, because you are always welcome in my office.
Yeah, please come visit. You know, Jeanné and I have fun offices with things to do. I have a puzzle out.
Well, you heard it here, folks. I hope everyone takes them up on their offer to stop by. One last question. As relatively newly elected legislators, what advice would you, just a couple words of advice, would you give someone who's thinking about running for office this year, particularly at the legislature?
Well, I said mine earlier, get a really good therapist. That's step one. I think the second step would be just go for it. We need you. As a progressive, I am asking, we need you. We need people who know what side they're on and are not going to be swayed by money or intimidation or any of it. We need people that are going to call bad players out. They're going to call harassment out. They're going to call for change. And that's what we need. So if you're thinking about running for office, do it and dedicate yourself to it, because you're dedicating yourself, not just your life, you're dedicating this to the movement. You're dedicating everything that you do to uplifting everyone around you. Because the reality is, I think as progressive legislators as well, one thing we didn't talk about is the fact that so much of politics is it's become so individualized, and it's become all about that individual legislator, and it's become about their name recognition. If we're going to pass progressive issues, it's about the value, it's about the bill, it's about the movement, it's about all of us, not about one of us. So be someone that commits to that kind of transformational change. I think on my office manager, he's my chief of staff, he's on this call, and he was telling me this morning as I was driving from the airport to the dance studio about the post that AOC just made. And it's about it's about this mosaic. She posted about our movement is like a mosaic. All the little pieces, we are all the little pieces that fit together that make this grand thing. Whether it's living wage or economic justice and social justice to affordable housing and healthcare, these are all the pieces that make up a beautiful mosaic of our communities and a movement for change. And we need every single part of it. And in order to make that happen, we need you in the building. So please, please, please choose to run, and then don't hesitate to reach out. There are lots of people that can help and are willing to help.
Sorry,
Adrian.
Sorry, I'm sorry. You think I'd get this down after 2 years, but a huge shout out to Chris Cofield, who is fire. There is a lot of advice that I can give anyone that wants to run. For me, the single biggest advice that I was given that I followed through with and I thought was the most beneficial was that if you do run, there will be a lot of outside forces trying to bend you to make you someone that you're not, and the reality is you just have to be authentic and honest. Voters and your constituency and people are not going to resonate to a fraud. And if they do, like they did with Donald Trump, it's probably not going to end up well for them. The biggest example was whether or not I was going to be out and open with my sexual orientation when I was running. And for me, I was going to be open, and I don't care what the consequences of that will be. I'd rather lose an election I'd rather lose an election if I can't be authentic with who I am. And but I saw the benefits of being out and open to, because you're inviting your constituent, you're inviting the public to a very private part of your life, and you're letting them know that you trust them, and in return, they should be able to trust you. And that resonates. And I think that's the single biggest advice that I can ever give anyone that is thinking about running, is to be authentic and to not bend on authenticity.
Thank you both. And we're so grateful for all of your time today, sharing your depth of knowledge with us. And of course, your commitment to progressive values and your passion for advancing priorities that are going to help our community thrive today and in the future. I just wanted to give you a chance to say any closing thoughts before we wrap up.
Just thank you. Thank you for allowing me to share this space with you, but also thank you for your efforts and your advocacy. The work that we do in the legislature is only because of advocates like you as well. And it takes, as I said earlier, it takes all of us working towards this movement of change. So I'm also going to thank you in advance for all of your efforts to help us get our living wage bills passed and the EITC bill, because the work's not over. It's going to keep going. And the reality is that next year we're going to come back and we're going to keep hammering until we get the things that we need. So thank you in advance, and thank you again for everything.
Yeah, I have to think. I want to thank Rep. Kapela for being here too. You know, it's always good to be on the same Zoom call with Rep. Kapela. She's so awesome. She's also fire. I also want to thank Will and Ryan for organizing this, and all of the YPDA members. I'm going to be honest. I don't think I would be where I am if it wasn't for me joining YPDA and not just building connections, but expanding on my worldview on issues and listening to what everyone had to say. YPDA was very beneficial for me in my work. We all have our experiences that we draw upon when it comes to decision making and law crafting, and YPDA was definitely a big influence on how I approach the world right now and the issues and working families. So, I really hope this organization expands and thrives. So thank you so much for inviting me here, and thank you for being a part of my life and giving me these experiences to be a good legislator.
Well, thank you again so much to you, Rep. Tam and Rep. Kapela, for sharing your afternoon with us, and to all of our guests and attendees here on Zoom and on Facebook Live and on the YouTube recording when we post it later. With that, I think we're going to wrap this up, but you know how to get in touch with your reps, and we'll hope to see you at the building sometime. Thanks, and have a good afternoon, everyone.